what they're doing in the streets of DC. I'd be curious to know, as somebody who worked the streets of DC for 20 years, what kind of concerns do you have? I think we just saw a big old armored vehicle, National Guard vehicle, T-bone a civilian car. What are some of the concerns you have about Donald Trump sending in the National Guard to police the streets of DC to do the job that y'all did and y'all did well?
Yeah, I mean, first, when it comes to specifically the National Guard, not the additional federal resources, but the National Guard themselves. Like I was telling your audience before we got cut off, I remember in early 2000s when I was first starting my career at the Metropolitan Police Department, we had an actual crime emergency. It was declared by Chief Charles Ramsey at the time. And I remember because we were literally experiencing multiple homicides, not weekly, but daily. We were having shootings, not daily, but hourly. And so there was a real need for some type of supplemental, uh, you know, resource to come in and help the Metropolitan Police Department tackle this problem. So we brought in, several hundred National Guardsmen, and they were unarmed, and their job was high visibility uh, in high crime areas. And also, they were taking over some of the lower priority responsibilities of the police department, like directing traffic. And so that freed up resources within the department to go out and conduct law enforcement activity and try to quell the problem. And I think it lasted for about 2 weeks, if I remember correctly, and then they were gone. This is a whole other issue. Now, there is crime in the District of Columbia. As someone who spent 2 decades policing there, I think that I can speak to, what I believe is a crime emergency, and it certainly was not something that we were experiencing. The federal resources, I think, are meaningful in that, you know, the Metropolitan Police Department is overworked and understaffed. And so bringing them in to help with law enforcement activities uh, is a positive thing if they're used appropriately. The National Guard, this is all theatrical. First of all, the vast majority of them, from what I've seen, in and around Washington D.C., are deployed on places like the National Mall and Union Station. In fact, the other day I was driving past the World War II Memorial and approaching the Lincoln Monument, and there was probably 50 National Guardsmen just kind of milling about, walking around. All of them, slung over their shoulder were their M4s, and they looked absurd, and I got the impression that they felt absurd walking around that way. And it's shameful to use people who signed up to put their lives on the line, whether it's in some type of catastrophic domestic event, or potentially to be brought up as active duty military and sent overseas to fight America's wars. To have them out there picking up trash, doing landscaping, or just walking around with an AR-15 slung over your shoulder in the middle of the National Mall, where absolutely nothing is happening other than people out there uh, jogging, taking in the sights, enjoying the day. It's just, it's all theatrics, and it's to those who oppose this administration. It is meant to intimidate them and to scare them into submission.
Mike, it's such a great frame of reference that you have, that you share with us, that, you were there when there was a crime emergency. I mean, I was there starting in the early 90s. I didn't start in
Yeah.
homicide until 97, but man, we had so much work to churn through, murder cases that had been open that were being closed. When you have multiple homicides, in a week, sometimes more than one a day. What we both know is that the homicide detectives are always working the fresh cases, right? And some of the stuff that should have been done on the earlier cases tends to fall by the wayside because, listen, MPD never had enough homicide detectives, in my opinion. Now, this comes from a career homicide prosecutor, so we always wanted more resources because death is different. Death is different. There are lots of crimes that impact victims in horrendous ways, but death is different. Death is final. And, we feel an obligation to do whatever we can to bring justice to the dead and their surviving family members. And it's interesting that you've seen a crime emergency when you were out there in the streets. And that was a time when perhaps federal resources were needed. The National Guard needed to be activated. As you say, part of it is just a high visibility thing to try to deter crime just because they're out there. Uniformed folks are out there. But, what we didn't have these days, presently, is a crime emergency. Indeed, MPD's stats, as published by DOJ in January, indicated crime was down. So we know this is nothing more than Donald Trump flexing his dictatorial muscle, right? Trying to show that he's a big man because he can deploy soldiers to the streets of
Well,
Washington, D.C.
right. And I mean, the other component there is, because I have these conversations daily, and a lot of people point to the juvenile crime problem that exists in the District of Columbia, and that is a fact. There is a problem there, and unfortunately, a lot of the blame lies at the feet of the city council for their approach to, you know, diversionary programs for juvenile offenders rather than real accountability. Um, but what is the National Guard going to do to quell that problem in the long term? I mean, obviously, if you flood the streets with police officers and armed National Guardsmen and put them on every street corner, crime is going to go down, but it's going to be temporary because the moment that they're gone, uh, it's going to come back. And, my question to those people is A, do you want to live in a country in which on every street corner there's a National Guardsman with an AR 15? And B, do you want to live in a country in where the president of the United States can usurp local authorities and essentially dictate to them how they are going to handle these types of problems, and also take away their authority over or the autonomy of the Metropolitan Police Department or any local police department? And if their answer is yes, Glenn, I remind them the fact that the pendulum always swings both ways, and eventually this administration will be gone. And will they be okay with, let's say, a Democrat president who doesn't like how the police are acting in a certain area, decides, you know what, I don't care what the residents of that state, of that city, feel about the policing. If they might like it, I'm going to come in there and I'm going to change things dramatically. And that whole heart, of course, the response is always absolutely not. That's not what I want. And so that's really, it's about, there's the intimidation aspect of this, but then there's the Donald Trump being an authoritarian and going in and usurping local, democratically elected leaders and saying, "Nah, I'm in charge here. I'm I'm the executive. I'm the head law enforcement officer, and I'm the head of the military. I'm the commander in chief. I'm all the things." And now he's looking to replicate that in other jurisdictions.
And I hope that the more his abuses ratchet up, the more it galvanizes opposition among the people, because at the end of the day, that's what it's going to take. It's going to take
Well,
we the people.
I mean, this is all, it's all frightening, but there are things that are happening. I mean, I was reading this Washington Post article the other day, and it focused in on, take for example the guy that threw the Subway sandwich at the officer, and the U.S. Attorney's office was trying to indict him for multiple felonies. in federal court. They couldn't get the indictment.
Yep.
And so, the people do have the power. At the end of the day, they can't be, this administration doesn't get to be the judge, jury, and the executioner. They've got to push their bullshit through a grand jury or a jury of citizens. And, the citizens didn't buy that. I have heard now he's been charged with a misdemeanor. And listen, like at the end of the day, throwing a Subway sandwich at a police officer can't condone that behavior. I
Right.
understand it. I understand the anger and the resentment towards their presence, but it is a violation of the law, and a
Yep.
misdemeanor charge is probably appropriate. But you know, the people stood up. And then the other cases that I've heard is, we've got this flood of federal agents coming in. And I mean, it's very clear to me that, there's an efficient and an effective way to employ those resources. They're not doing it.
Yeah.
They're going willy-nilly around trying to get arrests, stats, guns off the street. And one of the things that I found, uh, very profound was this judge. You might be familiar with him. His name escapes me. If you remember the case, shout it out, because I knew him. And he was not somebody I would say was a conservative judge, but he was a government friendly judge in my time as a police officer. And he said that it was a gun case, a felon in possession case. This was the most aggressive and egregious violation of this defendant's Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights that I've ever experienced, not only in my time as a judge, but it's my time as a federal prosecutor before that. And he threw the case out. And so what is the point of having these resources come in here if they're not going to adhere to the Constitution and make prosecutable cases? It's a big waste of time. It's a big waste of money. And you're doing absolutely nothing. You can make 1,000 bullshit arrests, but at the end of the day, you're having no effect on crime in the District of Columbia, because those people are going to be out because you didn't adhere to the rules.
Yeah. And I'm glad you raised the guy who threw the Subway sandwich at the police officer, because that was the last area I wanted to ask you about. Thank goodness we have the grand jury to serve as a check on prosecutorial overreach and abuse and misconduct. You know, Janine Pirro doesn't know what the hell she's doing in my old office. I was in that office for decades. I was in the grand jury daily. I was in court, both Superior Court and federal court, constantly. And what we all instantly knew, Mike, when we saw the video of that DOJ paralegal so frustrated and incensed at the fascism that Donald Trump was bringing to the streets of his city, our nation's capital, and his frustration, got the better of him, and he threw a sandwich at a police officer
Yeah.
into his bulletproof vest. First of all, we all know, because we lived this stuff in DC for decades, that's a misdemeanor assault. That is not an 8-year felony assault. It is an assault. More technically, it's a battery. Unconsented to touching with either your hand or you throw something at an officer, that's a battery. It's a violation of the law. And I would not suggest that this guy shouldn't be held accountable for that misdemeanor conduct. But when Janine Pirro sends prosecutors into the grand jury 4 times in 2 cases. Mike, first of all, grand juries don't no-bill cases. We've all heard that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich if the prosecutor tells them to. Well, apparently
Not
that's
if it's
not
made of Subway.
true. Not a Subway sandwich. Right. That's not true. The grand jury sits as the conscience of the community and as a guardrail against Janine Pirro's abuse and overreach. And thank goodness they did it.
That is the key word. That is the conscience of the community. Because the point that I was going to make was, I was there when in the aftermath of, George Floyd specifically.
Mm-hmm.
But, we had this culmination of Michael Brown and George Floyd and a whole host of polarizing incidents involving law enforcement and persons of color. And I remember there was a what we termed a runaway grand jury that was failing to indict any case that came before. And it was a RIP grand jury. Now I'm using jargon that not everybody's going to key onto, but we had a rapid indictment program, and that program was mostly for gun and drug cases that didn't have any civilian witnesses, just law enforcement officers. And now my camera's effing up here. Hold on. So just law enforcement officers and the defendants. And so we had a grand jury that wouldn't indict any of these gun and drug cases. And it was because they had lost their trust in law enforcement as a result of all the things, all this egregious behavior that they were seeing. And so, you know, not saying that that's right, not saying that that's what should happen, but my caution to the Metropolitan Police Department, to the officers that are out there that are allowing themselves to be co-opted into this moment without any pushback whatsoever, specifically not the rank and file officers, but leadership, you will inevitably see the same thing start to happen, in which you can't push good casework through a grand jury because you've lost the trust of the community. And that is something that will not be soon forgotten. It is different than that moment that I was describing, in that people are seeing how their police officers, their police department is co-opted into this moment, and that there's no resistance. There's no pushback publicly. And I understand why, but I'm simply telling them that this is something different, and that if they want to continue to work in these communities, that they're going to have to stand up at some point to this type of lawless behavior.
Yeah. And grand juries are required to bring a felony charge. Janine Pirro can't charge anybody with a felony absent the grand jury believing, one, there's enough evidence to support the charge, and two, it's the right thing to do. And to have the grand jury four times, once in the Subway sandwich thrower case, and three times with respect to a woman who stepped between an ICE agent and FBI agent who were trying to take into custody somebody because of their immigration status. And there was pushing and shoving, and that also looked like a simple assault. And they tried to charge her with a felony. The grand jury said no three times. So what
Yeah.
did Janine Pirro do? She had her prosecutors sign a complaint, and both of those protesters are now charged with misdemeanors. And
Yep.
I'm not saying they didn't commit misdemeanors, because listen, don't throw sandwiches at officers. Don't throw anything at officers. Don't put your hands on officers. Don't step between officers and people they're trying to detain lawfully. Don't do any of that. But Mike, you know what's coming? You know what's coming? A selective prosecution defense in two misdemeanor cases. And here's why I say that. Look at how Donald Trump's DOJ is treating these two protesters.
Yeah.
How did they treat the January 6th protesters, rioters, insurrectionists? They pardoned them.
Yep.
They bestowed enormous gifts on those protesters, but they are selectively trying to go after the two that they don't like. That is vindictive, but more directly, these two misdemeanor cases are going to become a shining example of the selective prosecution that violates the constitutional due process rights of these two protesters. I don't know if they'll win using a selective prosecution defense, but I will bet my full buck, that's my betting limit, that they
Yeah.
will both file motions to dismiss based on selective prosecution. And I want the federal bench, the federal judges, to cram down DOJ's throats every dirty prosecution that they bring, because
Yeah.
that's going to send a message loud and clear to the public that, look at what Donald Trump's DOJ is doing. I don't think this is sustainable, Mike, what DOJ is doing. I don't think it's sustainable. I think it's all going to come crashing down. Don't know when, how, or how much damage they'll do to we the people in the interim. But so listen, thank you for jumping on. Thank you for January 6th. Thank you for what you continue to do every day. You remain a democracy warrior in a different way now. But I appreciate you very much, brother.
Likewise. And I'm always Always ready to jump on with you, Glenn. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. All right.
Bye,
We'll
buddy.
see everybody. Take care.